In Geneva, Switzerland, that is the short but profound agenda for tomorrow's meeting between Secretary of State Baker and Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz. Baker and Aziz are in the picturesque lakeside city already maneuvering for position. NBC's diplomatic correspondent John Dancy is there as well tonight. John, what's the latest?
Tom, Baker arrived here in Geneva after a day of talking tough across Europe, but Tariq Aziz sounded surprisingly accommodating.
Baker arrived first after a 14-hour day that took him across Europe, Paris, Bonn, and Milan. His message was everywhere the same: no compromise.
I think there is indeed agreement between us that the chance for peace is in the hands of Saddam Hussein and in the hands of Iraq.
But Aziz dismissed Baker's talk as rhetoric and said Iraq is ready to talk peace.
But I would like to say that I have come in good faith. I am open-minded and I am ready to conduct positive, constructive talks with Secretary Baker if he shows the same intention.
Earlier today, by contrast, Baker signaled that he is not very hopeful about the Geneva talks, but he left the door open to further approaches to Iraq even after tomorrow's talks. The role of finding a new approach to Iraq after Geneva may fall to French President Mitterrand, who received Baker today. The U.S. and Mitterrand don't see eye to eye on the Middle East. The French support an international peace conference on the Middle East. The U.S. doesn't. But today, Baker sounded ready to give Mitterrand a shot if the talks fail here in Geneva.
President Mitterrand of France is so skeptical about prospects for the talks here in Geneva that he has scheduled his own news conference for tomorrow evening, at which time he presumably will announce his own approach to peace with Iraq. Tom?
Thank you very much. John Dancy tonight in Geneva. In Baghdad today, Saddam Hussein was quoted as saying that his struggle with the United States and most of the rest of the world was for Palestine and Arab dignity. As NBC's Tom Aspel tells us, from Iraq tonight, Saddam continues to try to take cover in the Palestinian issue.
Everybody loves a parade, even in these dangerous days. Intellectuals and artists marched through Baghdad this morning, calling for peace and calling for Saddam Hussein. George Bush got bad reviews.
Yes for Saddam. We want peace, but they have to understand what the meaning of the peace.
Peace on Baghdad's terms means holding on to Kuwait, negotiating a way out of the January 15th deadline authorizing the use of force against Iraq. The National Theatre Company, in rehearsal. This season's production was about the moral dilemma of an American soldier going off to fight in a foreign land. He goes home to lead an unhappy life. In the real world, Saddam Hussein met with Yasser Arafat today. The Iraqis say there's no question of leaving Kuwait until the Palestinian issue is solved. Information Minister Latif Nassif Jassim.
We will never draw out of Kuwait.
This is Iraq's official position on the eve of the Geneva talks.
Privately, Iraqi officials maintain Saddam Hussein is now comfortable with his position. The only chance for peace, the Iraqis say, is for James Baker to show some flexibility in Geneva. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Baghdad.
In this country, this from the Pentagon tonight, that report out of Saudi Arabia that 6 Iraqi helicopter crews had defected from Kuwait, not true. To the president's disappointment and the embarrassment of many others. NBC's Fred Francis at the Pentagon. How in the world did this happen, Fred?
Well, Tom, we all make mistakes, but this mistake by the Pentagon was a real doozy. It began when the vice governor of the eastern province of Saudi Arabia reported to CNN yesterday that these helicopters, 4 aircraft, were defecting. By the time that information bounced between 2 military offices in Saudi Arabia and here to the Pentagon, it was reported as fact by the Pentagon and by the military in Saudi Arabia. So much so that when the president woke up this morning, he wanted to know where those helicopters were, and Dick Cheney couldn't tell him. In fact, it sounds like it was all disinformation from the start.
Thank you very much, Fred Francis at the Pentagon. Truth, the first casualty of even pre-war. In Congress, as in every corner cafe, kitchen, office, garage, and classroom in America, war or not in the Persian Gulf was the issue today. NBC's Andrea Mitchell tonight on preparations for the formal congressional debate.
Declaring that it is time for Congress to act, the House Speaker and top Democrats started drafting what amounts to a declaration of non-war.
I think that we should not sidestep the issue. We're talking about life and death and war and peace, and I think we ought to face the issue.
Democratic leaders want to vote for continued economic sanctions and the use of force only in self-defense without prior congressional approval.
Offensive military action, the use of military force by the United States, would by definition be an act of war, and therefore the committing of the nation to such a war can be done only by the Congress.
But as the deadline for war approaches, the president's policy is gaining support.
The basic core argument as to why what we're doing is important is bound up in 3 words. It is aggression, oil, and nukes.
Believing that he can win, the president officially asked Congress today to endorse the use of all necessary means. In other words, military force to remove Iraq from Kuwait. Bush said anything less would encourage Iraqi intransigence. And in Los Angeles, the vice president demanded that Congress get behind the president. But Congress is deeply divided. At the Foreign Relations Committee today, 2 former secretaries of state, 2 conflicting views.
If we act precipitously, we will find ourselves virtually alone in a bitter and bloody war.
I find it inconceivable that the American Congress would be less willing to confront aggression than the United Nations.
Democratic leaders are saying tonight that by requesting action from Congress, the president is acknowledging their right to declare war. But a senior administration official says no such thing, that if Congress votes against Bush, he will ignore them. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News at the Capitol.
When Nightly News continues in a moment, Soviet troops...
Israeli helicopter crossed into Lebanon to an area that Israel still occupies, carrying the 4 Palestinians into exile. The men arrived bound and blindfolded before transferring to taxis hired to drive them north to Beirut. They are leaders of a group called Hamas, which last month was blamed for murdering 3 Israelis in Tel Aviv. They are Muslim fundamentalists. Israel once courted fundamentalists, trying to undermine the influence of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The U.S. has long opposed Israel's deporting of Palestinians because it violates international law. But now the matter is even more sensitive. Deporting Palestinians offends all Arabs, including some members of George Bush's anti-Iraq coalition. And Saddam Hussein could try to use the issue to argue that his occupation of Kuwait does not differ from Israel's occupation of land it has captured in war. But Israeli officials doubt that deportations can harm the coalition now, so close to the United Nations deadline.
Right now, the entire Middle East watches the situation in the Gulf and does not pay attention to what is happening over here.
But the Palestinian uprising against Israeli control is heating up once again, with 9 Arabs and 1 Israeli killed in the last 2 weeks. Numbers that will not keep Israel's policies on Palestinians out of the news. John Donovan, ABC News, Jerusalem.
Later in the broadcast, we'll have another report on the news, how the press will be allowed to cover the war in the Gulf if it breaks out. When we come back, Pan American Airways files for bankruptcy. And on
tomorrow's encounter here in Geneva between Secretary of State Baker and Foreign Secretary Tariq Aziz. Back home, a CBS News New York Times poll indicates a majority of the American people now expect war. Still, more than 2/3 say the U.S. should make further diplomatic efforts, including a direct meeting with Saddam Hussein before the January 15th deadline, just 8 days away. Bill Plant has been traveling with Secretary Baker, and he's here with me.
Well, Dan, the Secretary of State cracked open the door a little bit today to the possibility of other peace efforts. He's making something of a virtue out of necessity, because he's faced with the French apparent insistence to go ahead with their own peace initiative, especially if things don't turn out tomorrow exactly the way they'd hoped. So Baker embraced the idea of other peace efforts, but only up to a point.
We will welcome and do welcome any efforts to peacefully resolve this crisis. We seek a peaceful and political solution.
From England to France to Germany to Italy, Baker has preached Allied unity. But everywhere he went today, he heard quiet urging that peace efforts continue after his meeting tomorrow with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz.
We simply ask that those efforts be accomplished in a manner that does not send a mixed message and that does not somehow suggest that the deadline is going to be moved, because it isn't.
Before he arrived in Geneva tonight, Baker seemed to have tried hard to lower expectations for tomorrow's meeting, while Aziz tonight was still pushing for a negotiated solution.
I'm open-minded, and I'm ready to conduct positive, constructive talks with Secretary Baker if he shows the same intention.
The only signal that Baker wants to send tomorrow is one of no compromise, and the reason is that the U.S. regards January 15th as not the real deadline, knows that there will be more discussions later, and wants to go to them armed with what amounts to a declaration of war. Dan?
Bill, any real chance that Secretary Baker may yet wind up going to Baghdad to talk with Saddam Hussein face to face?
Not unless President Bush changes his